Ron Duncan Hart from the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you today who have joined the webinar. And it is my particular pleasure to introduce Rabbi Dr. Jack Shlachter, who is a physicist and former head of the theoretical division of Los Alamos National Laboratory, which was Oppenheimer's old position, if I'm not mistaken. He also had positions at the Brookhaven National Laboratory in New York, the Atomic Energy Agency, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, the latter two both based in Vienna, Austria. As the head of the theoretical division at Los Alamos, Dr. Shlachter supervised over 300 scientists working on research and theoretical physics, biology, mathematics, and those areas. And in parallel, he has been an ordained rabbi since 1995. He's currently the rabbi of Hamakom congregation in Santa Fe, and he's given rabbinical support to far-flung Jewish communities from Vienna, Austria, to Beijing, China, and other places in between. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shlachter.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's really an honor and a pleasure, and I appreciate both you and the committees providing me with this opportunity to give this talk. I'm going to go ahead and screen share, and we'll launch into the presentation. So this talk is supposed to be about the Jews at Los Alamos, New Mexico during the Manhattan Project. That's a very big topic. And I'm going to outline just a little bit about Los Alamos, New Mexico, about the Manhattan Project, and then focus in on some of the very interesting figures who were here. And the introduction that Ron gave, I really appreciate that. But it's probably better to back up a little bit in my career. I joined Los Alamos National Laboratory in 1979, and I didn't know anything about the history of Los Alamos. I just had this opportunity to come for a summer and to learn from a physicist at Los Alamos, but I didn't know anything about Los Alamos. And I'm not going to presuppose that all our listeners are totally familiar with this either. So let me just mention that Los Alamos is located about 100 miles by car from Albuquerque, New Mexico, Albuquerque being the big city in this state. And Los Alamos was established in 1943 as the secret and central research and development facility for an enormous project, which was called the Manhattan Project. And its goal was to produce the first atomic bombs and end World War II. So Manhattan Project and Los Alamos are intertwined. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the background for the establishment of Los Alamos. But how did I get into this topic? I joined theoretical division in 2010, I believe, and I started to explore the early history of the laboratory at that time, and I was struck by the strong Jewish presence during the Manhattan Project between 1943 and 1945, the end of the war. Many of the scientists who were brought to this secret city of Los Alamos were Jewish, and that's particularly true for theoretical division. I'll explain something about the structure of the laboratory in a little bit, but I joined theoretical division and was struck by how many Jews were in that division during the period of 1943 to 1945. Several of those individuals were refugees from Europe, and the overwhelming majority of the people who I did some research on were very colorful individuals with fascinating life stories. And none of them really had what you would call traditional levels of Jewish observance. And their Jewishness was apparent, but maybe not the way we might think of it normally, of Jewish ritual, Jewish practice. And so the title of this talk is actually intended to be somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that these people were Jews in theory, And originally I had focused this talk on the Jews in the theoretical division. It's actually now expanded beyond that. But the individuals were Jews in theory, meaning that they weren't so practicing in their Judaism, but well worth understanding. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But I do want to back up a little bit and give you some of the background about the origins of the Manhattan Project. And those origins really go back to about 1938. In 1938, two chemists in Germany, Hahn and Strassmann, discovered what we now call nuclear fission. And they did this by bombarding atoms with neutrons and didn't really understand what was going on. But they published some results in 1938. And then two Jewish scientists, Lise Meitner and Otto Hahn, Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch, Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch, explained the process as nuclear fission fairly quickly. Within months, they understood that there was a lot of energy being released. And the individual who's shown in this photograph, this is Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jewish scientist. He recognized that a bomb could be made using this process. That was really a very important early recognition. So he got quite worried because here were German scientists who had discovered fission, and Szilard recognized that you could turn this into a bomb. And that seemed really problematic to him. This photograph, which shows Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard holding a piece of paper that purports to be a letter, this is a recreation. You see, it says Life in the very bottom there. I think it was Life magazine that recreated this situation of Szilard and Einstein writing this letter, but that took place, that recreation was in 1946. The actual letter that was being written was done in 1939, when Szilard recognized that the United States better do something about this nuclear fission, and it would be a terrible situation if Germany ended up with a bomb based on this. So Szilard knew that he was a nobody, but he knew that if he could get to Einstein, Einstein could write a letter to the President of the United States, to Franklin Roosevelt. And that's what you see pictured on the right-hand side here is a copy of this typewritten letter. I'll just point out that you can see in the letterhead here, it's August 2nd, 1939 is when this letter was finalized. Szilard as far as I know, Szilard didn't drive a car, so he got two of his friends to drive him out to Long Island, where Einstein was summering, and they iterated on a few different trips with drafts of the letter. So Szilard got his two friends, Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner, who were two other Hungarian Jewish scientists whom he knew quite well, and both of them were able to drive. So they drove Szilard out to Long Island, where Einstein was residing, and they worked on this letter, which was eventually sent to President Roosevelt. And I'll just point out in the letterhead there that it says Old Grove Road, Nassau Point, Peconic, Long Island. Einstein actually got the address wrong. It turns out this was just a summer place that he stayed for 3 summers, I think. But my wife Beverly and I lived out on Long Island for a few years, and that summer vacation residence still stands. And there's a photograph that Beverly took of that residence. It's just, there's no plaque, no nothing. You just have to know that that's the house. Based on looking at other photographs. But they wrote that letter, or Szilard helped compose that letter. And the letter says, in part, that this phenomenon, nuclear fission, could lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. That's what was in the letter that was sent to Roosevelt. And for that reason, the letter really just languished. There was a little bit of effort to start some interest in exploring this, but not a lot of serious attention. By the way, Einstein, also Jewish, of course, did not work on the Manhattan Project. He was too much of a pacifist, and he didn't have the proper clearances to work on the Manhattan Project. So he spent the war years as a consultant to the United States Navy. Szilard, Teller, and Wigner were all instrumental in getting this going. But as I say, this letter didn't really do the trick. And so what is it that got the Manhattan Project going? It was a different letter. This letter, written by Otto Frisch and Rudolph Pyros in England, was written a little bit later. Otto Frisch, the nephew of Lise Meitner, who had worked with Hahn and Strassmann in Germany before she fled, Otto Frisch and Rudolph Pyros were part of the British contingent of scientists who were helping support England during the war. But because Frisch and Pyros were both Jewish, but also both from Axis countries, Frisch was from Austria, Pyros was from Germany, they were not allowed to work on the most important project that the British were working on, which was radar. And because they couldn't work on radar, they looked at the possibility of a practical nuclear weapon based on nuclear fission. And when they looked at this, independent of Szilard, their letter, which they wrote, that's this memorandum shown here, their letter says a sphere of metallic uranium 235 of a radius greater than R0, so just a placeholder, would be explosive. And here the critical sentence, one might think of about a kilogram as a suitable size for the bomb. That is a whole different situation, because if you remember, the letter that Roosevelt got said something about transporting this by ship and parking it in a harbor. But the memorandum by Frisch and Pyros said you could do this in something that could be carried by an airplane. And that changed the whole situation. So at that point, this letter made its way to the United States, and the British and the US ended up teaming up. And in August of 1942, the Manhattan Project was established, and the United States quickly surpassed what the British were doing. And so the British joined forces. Frisch and Pyros came to Los Alamos, and they worked at Los Alamos during the war. That's kind of the origin, if you will, of the Manhattan Project. How did the Manhattan Project get its name? It's because there was a building in New York City, in Manhattan, that was an Army Corps of Engineers office building. And that building was going to be the headquarters for this project. Why? Because it was close to the docks where uranium ore could arrive from the Belgian Congo, and also because it was reasonably close to Columbia University, where scientific talent resided. But it was quickly realized that this location in Manhattan was way too close to a large population center for a project developing a nuclear weapon. So instead, it was decided that the work should take place elsewhere. This individual, J. Robert Oppenheimer, was key in the establishment of the R&D headquarters of the Manhattan Project to be in Los Alamos. And let's see if I can turn that, like hiding. There we go. That's a little better. So Oppenheimer was the civilian head of this Manhattan Project. He worked with, and maybe in a sense for, General Leslie Groves, who was the military head of the entire project. And I actually should be clear about something. Los Alamos was the R&D headquarters, but the vast enterprise of the Manhattan Project took place at other sites, a major site in Tennessee, a major site in Washington State, where literally hundreds of thousands of people were employed to develop the material that was needed for the bombs. That really was the major industrial enterprise. But the R&D and the design was done at Los Alamos. Oppenheimer was a Jewish scientist who he had spent some time in New Mexico as a teenager, and he loved this area. He loved the desert country, the desert high country, we call it. And it was one of his real passions to spend time in New Mexico. He knew that this R&D project was going to be extremely demanding on scientists. And he felt that if the scientists were working in a place that was had physical beauty, that would help. And so he convinced General Groves that this area, the Pajarito Plateau, could be developed as the R&D center. There were a few existing buildings because of a boarding school for boys that existed here in what's now Los Alamos. And that school was basically condemned by the government. The students graduated quickly and left the premises, and those buildings were taken over by the Army, and that became the nucleus for Los Alamos National Laboratory. Oppenheimer turns out to have been a brilliant choice as the civilian head. He was a highly respected scientist, but he didn't really have any background in organizing a large project. And I will tell you that he initially estimated that the work of the Los Alamos project for the Manhattan Project could be done by 50 scientists and 50 technicians. That was his initial estimate. General Groves thought that that was an underestimate, and he tripled the number to 300. The actual population by the end of 1943 of Los Alamos was 3,500 people, and by the end of the war, it was over 8,000 people. So it was fortunate that that everything wasn't decided by that initial estimate of 50 scientists and 50 technicians. Oppenheimer was a theoretical physicist, and Oppenheimer decided that there should be a theoretical organization at the lab, a group who did the theory, who tried to figure out how to make this thing work by using paper and pencil and then primitive computers. And Oppenheimer thought that Oppenheimer would do two jobs. He would lead the laboratory, and he would also head the theoretical division. And he was convinced that that was crazy, that to do both jobs would be madness, that he should stick with leading the lab and get somebody else to head theoretical division. And so he did that. He picked a colleague, Hans Bethe, to head the theoretical division. And Oppenheimer was not so familiar with organization charts, and he really hemmed and hawed about setting up the structure of the lab. But in early 1943, he decided that there would be 4 divisions to the laboratory. One was the theoretical division, and he had appointed Hans Bethe to be the head of that. And then there were 3 more divisions that were all on the experimental side, one called physics division, one called chemistry metallurgy division, and one called ordnance engineering. And each division was then divided into groups, and that's the structure of the lab today, basically 80 years later. But as I say, Oppenheimer thought that he would both lead theoretical division and lead the lab. He was convinced not to do that. This picture, by the way, before we leave this slide, I just want to show you, this is Oppenheimer's famous pork pie hat. So you can always tell that that's Oppenheimer. But the other person in this picture is Louis Slotin, another Jewish scientist who tragically lost his life after the war in an experiment conducted at Los Alamos, where two pieces of radioactive material slipped together, and he got a massive radiation dose and died from radiation poisoning a few weeks later. But he separated the two pieces to avoid any exposure or serious exposure to others in the room, and he saved their lives, but it lost his life. I did want to share with you, if I can, let's see if this is going to work. I had an audio clip of Oppenheimer. I just thought it would be fun to listen to that. Let's see if we can do that. Whoops. Oh, there we go. So this from 1950, after the war. Remember, Oppenheimer wasn't terribly old at the time that he was leading the laboratory. He was in his late 30s, early 40s. Maybe that video is not going to play. Let's just go on. There we go.
Robert Oppenheimer realized the grave responsibilities of our new knowledge.
Science has profoundly altered the conditions of man's life, both materially and in ways of the spirit as well. It has extended the range of questions in which man has a choice. It has extended man's freedom to make significant decisions. No one can predict what vast new continents of knowledge the future of science will discover. But we know that as long as men are free to ask what they will, free to say what they think, free to think what they must, science will never regress, and freedom itself will never be wholly lost.
So, okay, so you got to hear a little bit of Oppenheimer speaking in 1950. As you may know, Oppenheimer subsequently lost his security clearance during the kind of anti-communist era of the United States. And just recently, like within the last month or so, his clearance was basically reinstated, though long after his death. Just a comment about theoretical division. I was very privileged to lead that division for 4 years, and it is the only one of the 4 original divisions at the laboratory that's still around. It's the only division that has, I'm sorry, physics division is still around, but it disappeared for a while. So theoretical division is the only division that has existed continuously since the lab was established in 1943, and it's quite a vibrant division today. Here is the roster, however, of theoretical division from 1945. So you can see there's far fewer than 300 names here. There are about 86 different names on this roster. And this was what was on my boss's wall when I first joined theoretical division. It's a most intimidating document, frankly, for anybody who's a physicist, because there are just one giant after another listed here. But it struck me that that there seemed like there might be a lot of Jews on here. And so I just flagged with arrows the people who I thought were probably Jewish, and then subsequently learned that that was true. And what was even more impressive than just the number is that almost every leadership position in the division was held by somebody Jewish. So here's the division office, the division leader, the deputy division leader, and the senior consultant, all 3 Jewish. Here's the groups 1 through 8. groups T1 through T8, but the group leader and the section leader Jewish, the T2, the group leader and an alternate leader also Jewish, T3, the group leader and the alternate leader Jewish, T4, the group leader and the alternate leader Jewish, T6, here you see the consultant, here T7, the group leader Jewish, T8, the group leader Jewish. Just a really astounding set of Jewish names here. That's what got me into this research. My estimate is that about a quarter of the individuals in theoretical division were Jewish. The only manager in groups T1 through T4 who was not Jewish was this section leader here, Klaus Fuchs. He was a spy, however. So in a way, I think from Jewish pride perspective, we did pretty well there. And really, theoretical physics was pretty much dominated by Jews at this time. It was called Jewish physics. Certainly, nuclear physics was called Jewish physics. It was almost all male, by the way, although Lise Meitner was an exception. And many of these people were refugees. And I'm going to talk through some of them. But let me just show you here. 4 individuals circled here went on to win Nobel Prizes in physics. Pretty amazing. All 4 of those were Jewish, by the way. And so now what I was going to do was to walk through some of those leaders, some of the Jewish leaders from theoretical division. So here's Hans Bethe, Jewish. But again, this is kind of this Jews in theory. His mother was Jewish, but Hans himself was raised as a Protestant like his father. He was later in his life dissuaded from marrying somebody who was Jewish because his mother thought that would be a bad idea. So, this has to do with how could Jews progress in society in Germany at that time. Hans Bethe, born in Strasbourg, which was in Germany when Hans Bethe was born. Hans Bethe, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1967, Hans Bethe was probably well suited to be the civilian director of Los Alamos, but he was unacceptable to General Groves because Hans Bethe was foreign born from an enemy country. And he was a very jolly individual, a very lively individual. And let's see if we can get this clip to go, because I had a recording of Hans Bethe also.
There was a very young man in my division, Richard Feynman, and I very soon noticed that his ability was far beyond the very great ability of all the rest of my division. And so we collaborated from the beginning. We extended Serber's formula for the yield of a nuclear weapon.
So I wanted you to hear his voice because I think you can tell the foreign-born component to his background. Just a quote about him, one of his colleagues said, unlike Oppenheimer or Niels Bohr, Hans Bethe was a jolly fellow. This individual who wrote this said, my office was down the hall and I could always tell when Bethe and Feynman were working together because there would be frequent bouts of guffaws and belly laughs. And whenever there was a moving picture in the base theater at Los Alamos and it was a comedy, you could always tell by the laughter whether Bethe was in the audience. Very sweet individual. I had the privilege to meet him when he came to Los Alamos one time and also to speak at the memorial service that was held in Los Alamos after Hans Bethe died. So Hans Bethe, the division leader of theoretical division, this individual, Vicky Weisskopf, was the deputy division leader of theoretical division, also Jewish. And he grew up in Vienna, Austria, in a comfortably middle-class Jewish family. Weisskopf's father was a successful lawyer, And Victor and his siblings were exposed to all the beauties of Vienna, concerts, the opera theater, all sorts of things. Weisskopf played piano quite well. He had a lifelong love of music, and his interest in science flourished along with his interest in music. In fact, late in life, he said that his favorite occupations were Mozart and quantum mechanics. Weisskopf was a beloved deputy leader of the theoretical division. People would go ask him questions, and he always had time for them. He recognized that leaving Europe was going to be critical to his future because of the anti-Semitism that he experienced. Jews were being excluded from significant academic positions after the Nazis came to power. And so he came to the United States in 1937. But I'll just share with you that Weisskopf recognized that it would be good if he could get out. But there weren't very many positions available in the United States. And there were a lot of outstanding physicists who were trying to get out of Europe at the time. So Weisskopf chose a field that he thought would be successful, namely nuclear physics, and he chose to publish something in English, which was not his mother tongue. But by doing that, he was offered a position in the United States. That's what got him safely out of Europe. So he's the deputy. And then this individual, Johnny von Neumann, was the senior consultant listed on that roster in 1945. And by almost everyone's reckoning, von Neumann was the genius among geniuses. He was the smartest one of anybody around, as far as most people could tell. By the age of 6, as you see, von Neumann could exchange jokes in Greek. He could do like 8-digit division in his head at the age of 6. By the age of 8, he had mastered calculus, and not just new calculus, but he had mastered it. By the age of 12, he was doing graduate level work in mathematics. He grew up in a very cultured environment in Budapest, in a middle class or upper middle class Jewish family, and he was really considered to be the wisest, or at least the smartest one around. It's said about him that he always was impeccably dressed. You see that in this picture of von Neumann with an early computer, and he's considered to be the father of the architecture of modern computers today. The whole idea of having storage registers and programs and all that was really his theoretical development. Here's a story about von Neumann, though. It says that he was a particularly bad driver. And why was that? It's because he would often be reading a book while he was driving. And one time he got into an accident as a result of that. He said afterwards, "I was proceeding down the road. The trees on the right were passing me in orderly fashion at 60 miles an hour. Suddenly, one of them stepped in my path." I think von Neumann, I just recently read a biography of von Neumann. There are so many anecdotes about his brilliance. It's amazing. Edward Teller said that Teller's 3-year-old son was playing with von Neumann one time, and von Neumann was speaking to this child at the child's level and was sitting down on the floor talking to the child and treating the child like a peer. And Teller realized, I think he does that with us too. He just treats us like we're his peers, even though he's far superior in intelligence. Maybe just skipping past the division office now and getting into the groups. This is Sir Rudolph Pyros, this individual, the second from the right, along with some of his British colleagues who came over to work on the Manhattan Project. And Sir Rudolph Pyros, as I said, was the co-author of that memo that went to the British government and then kick-started the Manhattan Project. Pyros was an expert on blast wave equations, and then that was used in the theoretical division to try to understand how an implosion system would work. So he was the group leader of the implosion theory group. I love this anecdote about Pyros. He went to England to work under a Rockefeller scholarship, and the Rockefeller Foundation said that he was obligated by the rules of the foundation to inform them of the results of his work. This is preceding his coming to the Manhattan Project. And so when Pyros's daughter was born, Pyros sent the Rockefeller Foundation a copy of the birth announcement and said, "Here are the results of my work." And apparently they were not very amused by that. Pyros says in his memoir that he was discriminated against for being Jewish. When he came to the United States from England, he stayed in a Cape Cod hotel in 1943 before going on to Los Alamos. And he experienced firsthand discrimination here in the United States. So it wasn't restricted, obviously, to just European anti-Semitism. One of his section leaders was this individual, Robert Christie. And I just want to point out that this whole business about figuring out who's Jewish and who wasn't is not so easy. Robert Christie, by name, I would have thought, no way is this guy Jewish, but he was actually born Robert F. Cohen, and the family changed the name for professional reasons. He was orphaned at the age of 10. He had a huge role to play in the development of the first atomic bomb. And I knew him because he was the provost at Caltech when I was an undergraduate there. But I had no knowledge of what Los Alamos was then or what role Christie had played, nor did I have a clue that he was Jewish until doing this research. Robert Server was the T2 group leader, and I'm going to walk through some of these fairly quickly. I hope this doesn't get too boring for anybody, but I put not just Robert Server's badge photo from when he came to Los Alamos, but also the badge photo of his wife, Charlotte Server, because she was the only female section leader at the entire laboratory during wartime Los Alamos. Oppenheimer recognized that it would be helpful to the scientists to have a technical library, and she was appointed to head that technical library. Serber had been Oppenheimer's student, and he was very knowledgeable about every aspect of what was understood of nuclear fission and how you might go about making a bomb. And so he developed a set of lectures, and everybody who came to Los Alamos in 1943 and 44 were given these lectures or listened to these lectures by Serber. They were eventually declassified, and you can go buy this book called The Los Alamos Primer by Robert Serber, and those were the lectures that were given at Los Alamos. This is a quote from the book Lawrence and Oppenheimer about Serber. It says, "A lean, dark, inconspicuous wisp of a man, Serber hated dramatics. While talking, he stumbled continually over his words, and he swallowed impatiently as though he had dust from the New Mexico mesa lodged in his throat, but he felt his subject too trivial to justify a sip of water. Nevertheless, he held his audience because he had everything Oppenheimer's group had uncovered, and he knew it cold, and that was all he cared about." So he clearly influenced all the scientists who came to work on the project. Just quickly, another one of the alternate group leaders in T2, Leonard Schiff, and here you can see a pattern. This is an individual who started college at the age of 14 and then got his PhD at 22. And, you know, I knew these people by name because his textbook on quantum mechanics was a standard textbook that I used. Schiff once said, "Physics is whatever physicists do." So I guess from that point of view, to come back to Ron's earlier question, I guess if a physicist is doing Judaism, then that's physics also. Robert Marshak was the alternate group leader of T3, and his parents were immigrants to this country, a familiar theme, received his PhD at 22. He had a huge influence on the whole field of physics because he was the president of the American Physical Society for a number of years and was really dedicated to helping economically disadvantaged people. Probably the most colorful individual of that whole batch was the group leader of T4, Richard Feynman, probably the most familiar name to people. Quite young at the time of the Manhattan Project, you can see, born in 1918. So he was in his 20s at the end of the is that right? Yes, I think that's right. He was in his 20s during the Manhattan Project era, but went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1965. He became kind of a household name because of his O-ring investigation of the Challenger accident. And here's, you see a photograph of that. Here you see him as a young man at Los Alamos. And I do want to play a clip of him if I can, because this is a New York-born scientist.
It's odd, but in the infrequent occasions when I've been called upon in a formal place to play the bongo drums, the introducer never seems to find it necessary to mention that I also do theoretical physics. I believe that's probably that we respect the arts more than the sciences.
Again, you know, I am not the world's best physicist at all, but I had the privilege of taking a full year class at Caltech from Richard Feynman, and that really was such an amazing gift to have that opportunity. Just a quick anecdote about Feynman. When Feynman showed up at Los Alamos, his wife was dying of tuberculosis, and Oppenheimer, with the humaneness that Oppenheimer had, he arranged for Feynman's wife to be down at the sanatorium in Albuquerque, and Feynman would make trips occasionally on the weekends, borrowing a car to get down to Albuquerque to see his wife. So when he came to Los Alamos, though he was married, he was by himself, and he was told that there would be two people in a room, but he didn't want to be sharing the room. And so he had one of his wife's nightgowns and some talcum powder, and he was put in a room that was supposed to be with two people. He made it look like there was a woman in the room with him, and the maids cleaned that up the next day. And then the next night, he put the nightgown out and put some talc on the floor. And after 3 or 4 days of this, nobody got assigned to share the room with him. So he was able to finesse that very, very cleverly. I'm just gonna, again, because Feynman, we could spend the whole day talking about Feynman, but I'll just quickly mention that Feynman had an alternate group leader in the small group that he led, T4, and this guy was even younger. So he was born in 1920. So in 1945, at the end of the war, he was only 25 years old. And he went on to become quite an important physicist in his own right, but very young at the time of the Manhattan Project. Hirsch Felder, a bit older than some of the others, but a bachelor when he showed up at Los Alamos, and he managed to figure out a way to get his mom to come as well. And so his mother was, talk about Jewish mothers, I guess, his mother was at Los Alamos during the war, as best I know. George Plotchek, the group leader of T8, the last of the 8 groups. George Plotchek, an amazing individual, probably committed suicide at the age of 50. You see, he died in 1955. Just wanted to share an anecdote about him. Plotchek was born in Bohemia, He was the only scientist at the laboratory from what was then Czechoslovakia to take part in the Manhattan Project. Plotchek, his grandfather was a rabbi, and his grandfather was a very enlightened rabbi and had a correspondence with Charles Darwin and a close friendship with Gregor Mendel. And that was the origin of Plotchek's interest in science. But this anecdote I've always enjoyed. This is before the war. Plotchek was invited to the USSR, and he traveled with Weizskopf. Plotchek made a list of things that were hard to get in the USSR to bring to Soviet friends. And among these many items, he wanted to include a large quantity of condoms. And since he had a very generous nature, he bought 1,000 condoms. And the plan was to assemble all of this in Weizskopf's apartment in, I think, in Vienna. And on the appointed day, Plotchek arrived, and he started unpacking the boxes with the chocolate and the slide rules and the tissues and the soaps. And then he hit his forehead with the palm of his hand, and he said, "Oh no, they were in Copenhagen, right? The Copenhagen taxi trade is going to die out." And we didn't understand what he meant. And he said, "I forgot the box with the condoms in the taxi." And so he had to go off and buy another box of condoms. To wrap up theoretical division, these were the other two future Nobel Prize winners, Fred Reiss and Roy Glauber. Fred Reiss was the only one whose research was done at Los Alamos, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize. To this date, that's the only work that was done at Los Alamos which was recognized with the Nobel Prize. Long after Fred Reiss left Los Alamos, he got the prize in 1995, but the work that he did discovering the neutrino was done while he was working at Los Alamos. And Roy Glauber, the last of these Nobel Prize winners from theoretical division that I'm going to mention, he was born in 1925. He came to Los Alamos as a scientist to work at the lab at the age of 18. And after the war, he had to go back to Harvard to finish his undergraduate degree. And he said in his Nobel Prize speech that resuming the life of an undergraduate at Harvard early in 1946 proved surprisingly difficult, even though I needed only a few credits to graduate. Having had a team of assistants to do calculations for me at Los Alamos didn't make it any easier. I found to do my own homework back at school, particularly when I felt I had moved beyond all that. So he had to struggle going back to be a regular person after the war. I had the privilege to get to meet him when he came to Los Alamos as well. In the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly touch on a few individuals outside of theoretical division. But before I do that, let me show you that the conditions at the laboratory were not what you would call elegant laboratory conditions. That does not look like a sophisticated lab. Otto Fresh, I mentioned earlier, Otto Fresh came to the laboratory from the British contingent, and he had a very important role to play at the lab, and his technician assistant was a very important member of the Jewish community in Los Alamos after the war, and many of us in the Jewish community knew Jay Wexler quite well. Jay worked closely with Otto Fresh. Otto Fresh had this lively social life when he came to Los Alamos, but he was a bit absent-minded. And one time there was an announcement made over the paging system at Los Alamos that said, "Will the person who invited Otto Fresh to dinner please let him know who you are?" This is Felix Block. He went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1952. I don't know that much about him. He only spent a few months at the laboratory in Los Alamos. He came in the summer of 1943, but he left in November because he didn't think that the work there was that interesting. He did go on to win the Nobel Prize. This individual, on the other hand, stayed during the war and was very important in the in the development of the plutonium bomb, because he recognized that the original design that people had was not going to work. That was a hugely important discovery during World War II. Segre was a brilliant Jewish scientist, brilliant Jewish experimentalist, and although he wasn't religious, his grandfather had designed the beautiful synagogue in Florence, Italy. If you've ever seen that synagogue, you'll know what I mean about how beautiful it is. This is a photograph of possibly the most important experiments that were done at Los Alamos. And I show this only because these two individuals, it turns out, this is the iconic photograph of this experiment, a really amazing experiment for its time, using a huge radioactive source, a kilocurie. It's an enormous radioactive source. But both of these individuals, it turns out, were Jewish. This is Gerhard Friedlander, who had a career at Brookhaven National Lab after the war. And this individual, to the best that I know, is Norma Gross. And while I can't prove that she was Jewish, what I did find out is that her maiden name was Finkelstein, that in her household Yiddish was spoken, and that when her husband died, her husband Leo Gross had a memorial service at the Ethical Cultural Society in New York. So I'd say the odds are quite high that both of them were Jewish. That experiment was led by this individual, Bruno Rossi, another Italian Jewish scientist, and he went on to develop some equipment that was used for decades after the war as part of equipment to test, to make measurements when an atomic bomb was exploded. And so when I was in the laboratory working in physics division, we had what were called Rossi oscilloscopes, and they were named after this individual. Edward Teller, I mentioned briefly as the chauffeur for Leo Szilard to take the letter out to Einstein. Teller went on to have kind of a bad reputation in Los Alamos. He wasn't so easy to get along with. He actually wasn't in theoretical division in 1945 when that roster was shown, because he had gotten bored with fission and was interested in nuclear fusion weapons, and so he was shunted off by himself. He had a singular role, I think, in contributing to Oppenheimer's loss of his security clearance. This individual, Stan Ulam, worked with Teller and was a co-inventor of thermonuclear weapons. Ulam went on to stay in New Mexico and work for most of his career in this area. And this individual, I. Rabi, he's the one on the right. He had his Nobel Prize already in 1944. He didn't actually come to Los Alamos to work on the project, but rather was a consultant. He served as a consultant to the project, and he also was very important in preventing Oppenheimer from making all the scientists become members of the military. He convinced Oppenheimer that that would be a bad idea, and that instead the scientists should remain as civilians. That seemed quite important. So the last individual I want to touch on is Sir Joseph Rotblat. This individual went on to win the Nobel Prize, but not in science. He won the Nobel Prize in 1995 in peace, because he recognized that that nuclear weapons and war were all bad things, and he devoted his life to diminish the part played by nuclear arms and to eliminate these weapons. His story is in some ways quite tragic. He was a Polish physicist who was invited to go to England and work in a laboratory in England. and he was ready to leave Warsaw in late August 1939, and his wife was ill and remained in Warsaw because she couldn't travel right then, and she was going to follow a week or so later. So Rotblat went to England in late August 1939. The war started with the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Rotblat's wife, Tola, was trapped there, and throughout the war, he never heard what had happened. She was killed in the Holocaust, but he never saw her again, and it affected him profoundly for the rest of his life. When he was working at Los Alamos, he was very principled. He was told that people had to be either US citizens or British subjects. Remember, he came to England from Poland, and he said no, he didn't want to do that. And so they waived the requirement, and he did not have either US citizenship or British subject status. He had strong reservations about developing these weapons. And in March of 1944, he overheard a comment from General Groves that the real purpose in making the bomb was to subdue the Soviets. And by the end of 1944, it was pretty clear that the Germans weren't going to develop a bomb, and Rotblat left the project. And he was the only physicist to leave the project on the grounds of conscience. So I'm going to close this talk by going to an interview with Rotblat late in his life, and we'll hear his words.
Even if we destroy all the nuclear weapon warheads, the knowledge of how to make them cannot be erased. We cannot disinvent nuclear weapons. And therefore, this which I keep saying is that the abolition of nuclear weapons is the first step to a safer world. The ultimate step is abolition of war. This is something which we called for in the manifesto, and which becomes more and more important as they go along. And this, of course, seems to people like a fanciful idea. I mean, war always existed. This is the argument. Men always went to war. And I say this is not true. I mean, it's true that it existed before. It doesn't mean that we should therefore extrapolate this should be the same in the future, because the world keeps changing. The world today is so different from the world, say, the last century, several decades ago, that what was impossible at that time has become possible now. But the only thing was I should give up.
And so I'll just close with an acknowledgments and references here. I want to thank Alan Carr, the lab's historian, my former boss, theoretical division leader Tony Redondo, who brought me into theoretical division, my colleague from Brookhaven National Laboratory, Ed Sierra, who helped me with this talk. And most of all, I really want to thank Ron Duncan Hart, who inspired the whole talk many years ago and suggested that I look into this history. Here's a list of some of the sources that I looked at, and you see my website and my email address there, and I'm happy to correspond with anybody who has an interest in going deeper in any of this.
Wonderful. Jack, thank you so much for this this very, very interesting talk. We have a number of questions, and so if you're willing to look at these,
I would be delighted. So let's see what I can do here.
Michael Grubler says, when did the Allies first learn that Germany might be working on an atomic bomb?
I think certainly Szilard was quite concerned that they might be thinking about this, because he realized that if he could put two and two together and figure out that fission could be used to make a bomb, the Germans had quality scientists, they could do the same thing. So I would imagine by the time the Manhattan Project was started, certainly by 1942, I think the Allies realized that Germany might be working on a bomb. I don't know that much about the history of the German effort. I know that Heisenberg is associated with that, and I know that the Germans thought that it was just such a massive industrial project to develop the material. That's really the hard thing, is to make the material. I think they just suspected that it just wasn't worth it. I mean, I saw a number that said that the number of people who worked on the Manhattan Project was about 600,000 people. And of course, that's not what was at Los Alamos. That's what was at Hanford and at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And I think they just couldn't envision that somebody would really do something that complicated. So I don't know the answer to that, but I think that Germany could well have been working on a bomb, and people realized that as soon as they realized that you could put this technology to that end result. I see a question there about no Jews in T5. I don't know that that's true. I certainly didn't look at every single name in T5, but let me make a comment about that. There are several people in theoretical division who were not scientists brought into the project, but were basically crank turners. They were soldiers who had had some scientific background and could work either as technicians, or they were the wives of scientists who were brought to the laboratory, who could run the adding machines and the primitive computers that were used and didn't have to know a lot of science. And I think because the pool of people for the scientists in T5 who did these calculations was a different pool, it's not so surprising that I didn't find any obvious Jews among them. It's not really true. Edward Teller's wife was one of the people, I think, in T5, Mitzi Teller. I'm not so sure if she was Jewish or not, because again, in the cultured society of Central Europe in the 30s, it probably wasn't that good to stay Jewish. Lots of people were baptized. Lots of people tried to leave their Jewish identity behind. So I'm guessing there probably were some Jews in there, but I didn't find them, and certainly no big name scientists. I see a question also about elaborating on the spy in Los Alamos. There were more than one spy. There was more than one spy in Los Alamos during the war. But the individual who I mentioned in T Division was Klaus Fuchs. And he was, I believe, the son of a Protestant minister. And he came as part of the British contingent, if I'm not mistaken. And ideologically, he just didn't like the idea that the United States would have a monopoly on this technology. And so he felt that the Soviet Union, I think he was very left-leaning, and he felt that the Soviet Union should have access to this as well. He was a quality theoretical physicist. He was not just a grunt. And so he kind of knew what was going on. And my understanding is that he felt it important to transmit that information to the Soviets. And I can keep going through these. You should tell me, Ron, how best to handle this.
Go ahead. You're good.
All right. Well, I'll just keep going through this list then. Were former Nazis recruited to work at Los Alamos? Not that I know of. I mean, certainly I'm not aware of that. I mean, I think there was enough heartburn with anybody who even came from an Axis country. I can't imagine that that would be the case, but I might be wrong. Not an expert on that. Steve Wender says, can you share thoughts or comment on the recent growth of anti-Semitism in the United States? What I can tell you is that I don't travel so much right now. I'm still a little bit COVID shy, if you will, but I am going out of my way to travel to Los Angeles in a week. to go to a conference for rabbis to gain some knowledge and tools to deal with the growth of anti-Semitism in the United States. So if you pulse me after the January 30th conference, I will know more. If you want to read an interesting book about sort of how democracy can shift gears and anti-Semitism can rise, I recommend The Plot Against America by Philip Roth. It's a novel, but it does kind of show how anti-Semitism can grow in a country despite it having a liberal tradition. I'm happy to talk about that more offline. Let's see. Oh, and here's another question about Nazi scientists coming to. I don't know anything about that. I mean, if that's the case, I'm just not aware of that history of Nazi scientists coming to the United States. What work is being done at Los Alamos today? That's a wonderful question. I can tell you that there's work on all sorts of topics. There are probably 12,000 employees at the laboratory today. It's really an amazing scientific institution. It went almost to zero because after the war, it wasn't clear that you needed an institution like Los Alamos. But then the laboratory stayed, and the laboratory became more diverse in its portfolio. Of course, it had a singular mission during the war to develop the first atomic bombs. But after the war, the laboratory's portfolio became more diverse. I can tell you in theoretical division, where my colleagues resided at the end of my career at Los Alamos, they were doing cutting edge work on understanding mutations of the COVID virus. So, you know, there's all sorts of work done, both experimentally and theoretically, mostly in the physical sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology. But it's a premier institution for cross-disciplinary, complex projects, and understanding the nature of vaccine development, for example, is a wonderful example of that.
Let's take one more question if we can here, and we'll make this a big one in a sense. Rick Vitale says, if not observant Jews, were there any people that you mentioned, believers in transcendence, such as the God of Spinoza? What about Einstein?
Like Einstein. Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know that much about their beliefs. I've read memoirs of several of these individuals because they're just such fascinating individuals. Very rarely does anybody in their memoir go into anything about their spiritual beliefs. So I just don't know. I mean, if there's a final punchline I can throw in there, I mean, they all were quite brilliant, quite interesting individuals. You can't imagine that they didn't think about the great thoughts about, you know, what happens after we die and why are we here and all that. They must have thought about those things as well, but I'm just not familiar with what their views were. So it's just a shortcoming on an amateur historian's part.
Rabbi Dr. Jack Shlachter, thank you so much for this brilliant talk and introducing us to this particular piece of history, which is important for us to know about. And we thank you for being with us today in the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and look forward to further conversations.
Thank you. It was an honor to do this, Ron.